So let me do a quick check of who's in the audience. A little call and response. So, ayo! So there's a couple of people who do that. So I'm a big fan of call and response, and I run a hip hop organization. So I want to do that one more time just because I've actually been to this museum several times, and I've always wanted to do what I just did. So I'd love for everyone who didn't just say I, when I say ayo, the response is I. So if I'm loud, you're loud. If I'm quiet, you're quiet. So ayo! I. Thank you very much. All right, so a little bit about me. So one of the things I love to do, since the topic is love, is challenge underlying assumptions, things that we take for granted. I remember a conversation I was having with a set of artists, particularly hip hop artists, about something really simple. And that was about whether or not people knew each other's government names. That's the name that your mama and your daddy call you. Do you actually know the names of the artists who you love? Do you know what their parents call them? And what I found is that most people, the answer to that question was no. Because for a range of reasons, including the fact that part of becoming an artist in hip hop is beginning to accept the idea that you get to redefine yourself, to reimagine what's possible. And so as an individual, I've had several names. I was born Mazi, but in college, my alias was Militant Mazi. When I was online, my line name was Wolverine. And for the last 14 years, my name has been for the last 14 years, my name has been Mr. Words, Beats, and Life. Because I used to wear the t-shirts all the time like you saw in the picture. But part of what having this kind of a creative opportunity has allowed me to do is to continue to reimagine who it is that I am and what it is that my life means in the world. And I think that this is one of the greatest gifts of a creative life or a creative community, is constantly reimagining what's possible. A little bit of background. So for those of you who don't know that much about hip hop consists of 5 basic elements: DJing, graffiti, MCing, b-boying, and knowledge of self. So what is that? That knowledge of self piece is super important to folks like me, because usually one of the first questions I get asked when I say I run a hip hop organization is, so do you rap? And my answer is always, no, I don't. But I do understand myself and my connection to the community that I'm a part of. So this idea that knowledge is something as a hip hop community that's valued, and the people that take the time to know and to understand have a place in this community. That, for those of you that don't know, hip hop has a set of founding principles, which were peace, love, unity, and having fun. And so when I was having the conversation about preparing for this talk about love, I thought to myself, I would love to have that conversation for a range of reasons, including the fact that it would provide me the opportunity to say in front of a group of about 200 strangers and a couple of friends something I've never said to anybody. And that is that love is not the reason I started Words, Beats, and Life. Creativity actually isn't even the reason I started Words, Beats, and Life. I actually started it because someone asked me a question I didn't have an answer to. We began as an organization as a conference at the University of Maryland, and someone from the community came and asked me, what do we do after this conference, Mazi? What's happening next? And the truth is, like most college students, I wasn't thinking beyond my campus. I was just thinking about how to engage the student population. And so when I founded the organization, I wanted to answer that question. We began with an after-school program, and then started doing programming for adults. And it was all about programming, but it wasn't necessarily about an undergirding set of principles or philosophies. It was really just, we just want to do good in the world. And so one of the things that's happened over the course of the last few years is beginning to not just take the foundational knowledge we were given, but to challenge and push back and innovate. So now when we talk about hip hop, specifically we talk about sampling, remixing, innovation, and technology as being fundamental parts of the culture, fundamental parts of its future. And so part of loving hip hop is not just doing what it is that we've been told it is, but about reimagining what's possible, reimagining how it is we understand it and how we relate it to people who have no connection to it. So, to that end, one of the things that we did, probably beginning about 3 years ago, was to start to reimagine why we were doing the work, what it is that was really at the foundation of our approach. And so the first thing we did was start to think about the cause. What is it that we're actually trying to do in the world? How is it that the world is going to be a different place because we exist? And how is it that people who don't value what we do can actually benefit from our existence? It involved us thinking about things like how does we approach youth development and why it is that it was important for us to bring in people who believed not just in the transformative power of hip hop in the abstract or the arts or creativity in the abstract, but were themselves transformed by it. So that the people became the second most important thing in the work. It wasn't about the program, it was about creating a space for the people who actually wanted to do the work and understood its value. And with those people, we engaged community. This is actually the thing we're most known for as an organization, for those of you who've never heard of Words Beats in Life, is the work we do with young people. And this is actually the very first program we launched. And the idea there was that young people who go to schools that don't necessarily have creative outlets are looking for community. So how could we create a community for them where they would have access to people from across the district, across artistic disciplines, across ages, in a space that was safe and nurturing and affirming. And so for us, that was the creation of the Academy. This is literally the very first thing we did. But then we began to think about how is it that we could not just engage young people, but how we could engage adult communities. Because so much of the work that's done in the nonprofit sector is siloed. It's super about figuring out your niche, digging down really deep there, finding the funding for it, and making it happen. But what would happen if we actually created a space where we trained young people to grow up or to grow in skills to compete or to showcase or to excel next to their teachers, not just being taught. So this idea of creating spaces beyond the recital model, where young people are basically brought into community, not just brought into program. And this was really rooted in a strategy to build not just individual young people, but a strategy to build on community that already existed and invest in expanding community. So it expanded the way we thought about it. So the cipher as a concept made sense to us. For those of you who don't know what a cipher is, it's a circle. I like to call it a sacred circle of interconnectedness, this idea that there's this group of people who create a circle in which performance happens in the middle. And most people talk about the middle, this idea, for those of you who've seen an MC battle or a b-boy battle, usually there's a circle or a semicircle, and inside of it, people are performing. But no one ever talks about the people that are actually the circle. This idea that they are a protective force for what's happening in the middle, so that both are necessary. Just like the idea of investing in young people, but not investing in the adults that teach them, is not actually a sign of love or reciprocity. So one of the things about most organizations, particularly that work with young people, is they kind of have a split in the way they think about the young artists they're cultivating and the older artists they employ. And I think part of that is because one of the things that people like me who start organizations, or folks like you who either work in or start organizations, we don't necessarily think about what are the undergirding principles that really should govern every single interaction that we have with human beings. And so this is why this conversation about love was especially interesting to me. The third thing we did was start to think about not just how we benefit the hip hop community. This is actually a question I've been wrestling with a lot lately, which is how do people who don't care about hip hop benefit from its existence? And I know there's lots of ways that happens technologically, whether that's the way that your iPod shuffles music and blends it, which comes out of DJ culture, or the way that we talk about call and response as a surviving Africanism that lives in hip hop, that comes out of a black church. There's lots of different ways that people benefit. And then about 8 years ago, we had the opportunity to start doing work abroad. Thinking about our community as not just being here in Washington, D.C. or in the United States, but thinking about how the world community was engaging in hip hop. And what we found in a lot of instances is that people abroad were, for the most part, replicating what they saw happening in the US, as opposed to doing what hip hop initially did, which was challenging young people and their parents and their community to rethink things like public space, to rethink things like the handing down of traditions through folk music and culture. And so part of the challenge that we have as a creative community is to, again, not just accept what we've been told or what we've received, but to reimagine. And about 2.5 years ago, we started really focusing on economic development for young people. In a lot of ways, nonprofits exist. One of my favorite rap lyrics ever was from this Baltimore group called the Dirt Platoon. And the quote was, "Organizations are organized in the interests of the organizers." Which is a really powerful idea, as opposed to organizations are organized in the interests of the communities they're supposed to serve. And I think part of that is because the underlying principle for most work is not love. It is not compassion. It is not empathy. It is the idea of trying to make a difference. So part of the reason I came to this work is that I am literally what would have been called a throwaway child. I was a young person who literally in my middle school, they created detention for me. Literally, I was the first person because the principal got tired of having me come to his office every day. So he said, we need a separate room where Mazi goes. Instead of suspending him, instead of doing in-school suspension, we just need a place where we can just put him. And part of the reason that no one ever really discovered in middle school was that the reason why I was acting out in class or the reason why I wasn't excelling is I had an undiagnosed learning disability. And so rather than actually figuring out what was the root of my challenge, they just figured, let's move him over here. And we see this not just in the case of people like me as individuals, we see this with whole communities. That the idea of tackling poverty or tackling poor education is something that we talk about, but very rarely are creatives involved in a conversation of imagining something new. And so, I've been talking about this question: how do people who don't care about your work benefit from it? And I think this isn't just a question for Words, Beats, and Life. I think this is a question for this larger creative community. Lots of you do things that are super valuable to the community that you serve. But how does actually the human family benefit from your existence? And I don't pretend to have the answer for everyone, but I pretend, or I believe that it's important to ask that question of all of you. How do people who literally don't know that you exist or care that you exist benefit from the fact that you do? For us, the answer has been kind of twofold. The first was that part of the way people benefited from our existence was we created public art. So most people like murals, they like street art. So even if you didn't know that it was done by us or value that we exist, you valued what we created. But I think now the thing that we're beginning to wrestle with is a different answer, which is really related to this idea of having transformational conversations. As an example, right? So there's tons of talk right now about what's going on with police around the country. And most of those conversations really actually go back to solutions that were proposed by my parents and their parents' parents. And I don't know how much of that is because of that. Those are the conversations that make it to the media. And how much of that is because folks like us are actually not engaged in those conversations because we don't see those things as connected to the work we do. And maybe they're not connected to the work that we do, but maybe they're connected to the fact that we're an interconnected set of people, that cipher concept, the sacred circle of interconnectedness. That's what it means to be a community, to be a nation, to be a creative, to recognize that what you do is sacred and has a connection to all of existence. Beyond conversations, what about the systems and institutions that impact us? So I love to use examples of things like we talk about school reform, but really the most basic thing that almost everybody in this room probably knows about schools that nobody ever talks about as the first thing to do when changing schools is how is they're funded. The idea that schools are funded by the tax base of the properties around them. No one ever talks about that, as if money doesn't make a difference. And some people say money doesn't make a difference, but if money doesn't make a difference, why is that the system that's set up, that's based on money? So how do we, as creatives, begin to challenge legislators, school boards, institutions that impact our lives but don't necessarily impact our work? And maybe you're a person that doesn't have kids or doesn't know anybody that have kids, but you eventually will be someone that is old enough that the young people of this country will be responsible for your care. And so what will they say that you did to care for them? This idea of imagination, it's so funny, right? Most of us who are creatives usually have conversations with large institutions about things like marketing or how to expand their audience. But it's almost never a conversation about how your creativity could transform the actual ways the institution works. And why is that? I was literally in a conversation yesterday with creatives about HR, and many of the people in the audience talked about basically replicating the same system of injustice that most of us left regular jobs for. So how is it that you go to a creative place and they're not creative in the way they think about you as a human being who contributes to the existence and the perpetual work of that institution? I think part of the answer is because though we're creatives, we allow ourselves to be pushed to the side and only go to things like hearings about the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, but never an oversight hearing about the police, never an oversight hearing about schools, unless it's to say there should be more arts programming. But what about if we actually challenged creatives that work independently to do things like become an unofficial substitute corps? So that when young people get substitute teachers, I don't know about you all, but when I was in school, when we had a substitute, that was literally the day to throw paper, make airplanes, and have fun. But what if they had an artist that day who handed out the work they're supposed to do, but also said, after you're done with that, we're gonna do an activity. Could you imagine young people excited to have a substitute because they actually get to unleash their own creativity? It's not a revolutionary concept. It's not even a heavy lift. It's saying, you know what, I work for myself. I'm actually gonna sign up to become a substitute and go and work in schools and bring my creativity into that space and transform it and be transformed by it. If we were gonna start to talk about transforming institutions, which ones would we actually focus on? The example I love to give is the Department of Employment Services here in Washington, D.C. And the reason I love to give that example is because they're basically the branch of DC government or the Department of DC government that's responsible for funding things like the Summer Youth Employment Program. Anybody familiar with that program? Like 3 of you? Okay. So they often do presentations about funding opportunities that exist. And one of the things I've seen in 3 separate meetings is someone come and ask them, well, how about funding apprentice programs or training programs for young people in the arts? And their literal response at all 3 meetings was there are no jobs in the arts. Which is really interesting, because if you go just up to a different part of the city and go to the Office of Planning, the Office of Planning has a report that says that the #2 employer in Washington, D.C. is the creative sector. So how is that? That one branch is actually responsible for training young people for jobs, says there are no jobs in the sector that most of us are a part of, and the branch that's actually responsible for finding the data says that's where all the jobs are. So why is it that an entity that's responsible for preparing young people for employment are not preparing them for the actual employment that exists? I could be a conspiracy theorist and say reasons that I think that is, but I won't. I'll actually attribute good intentions to them. And I think part of the answer is we don't make the case for the kinds of jobs that exist in our community to legislators, to bodies that are actually responsible for making decisions about funding. That we often seek funding but don't advocate for it. And if we do advocate for it, it's from a position of weakness. This idea that we want to see the levels of funding for particular things be maintained. But what if we actually had a more expansive point of view? And we actually started to think about the way the creativity and the arts, and I don't just mean the production of artwork, but like literally the creative process could actually transform the way that young people learn, the way that schools operate, the way that the police engage the community. What would actually happen if all this creative brainpower in this room decided that for the next year they were going to focus on the 29 police departments that operate in Washington, D.C.? Did anybody know there's 29 police departments that operate in Washington, D.C.? No, right? D.C. is literally the most policed piece of territory in the United States of America. That's including Amtrak, that's including the regular police you see, park police, library police, Smithsonian police. There's tons of different departments. So what would happen if we actually started to think about these systems that either support or challenge our lives in ways that actually benefited more people, period? I think part of the reason why we don't do that is because we live in a system that basically says, if it's working for you, then it's working. As opposed to saying, if it's working for us, then it's working. How do we challenge that? I think part of the reason why we don't challenge it is because we think about failures of institutions as just kind of broken systems, as opposed to systems that aren't governed by an underlying principle, this idea of love. Like, if you actually loved young people, what would you do for them? If you actually loved people that were incarcerated, what would you do for them? If you actually saw them as connected to you and your life and the future happiness of yourself and your family, what would you actually do for them? What would you do with them? How would you engage them? How would you think about the role of institutions like the one we're in or the ones we're part of in a way that benefits people other than the niche community that you're a part of? And I think that part of the reason why I'm stuck on this idea is because for 13 of our 14 years, I've only cared about the hip hop community. Anybody that wasn't hip hop, I wasn't really interested in convincing you or engaging you or talking to you. In large part because I felt like my community needs my support. Until last year, when the DC Council proposed legislation to double the fines for illegal graffiti in Washington, DC. If you were caught doing illegal graffiti, the proposal was a $2,500 fine, and I believe 3 months in jail. But they took it a step further. They didn't just say if you got caught doing illegal graffiti, you would go to jail and pay a fine. They said if you were caught in possession of artistic supplies, you could actually go to jail and be fined. So literally in DC, you can possess marijuana, but you can't possess spray cans. That's literally crazy. And so the idea that my community or people that I see as a part of my family were attacked by an institution that I've chosen personally to not engage helped me to think differently about the work that I do and what it means to be a creative in this city, that it's not enough that your organization is dope or that you do amazing events that people show up to. What are you doing to actually change the institutions that impact our lives, either directly or indirectly? I would argue that most of us aren't doing much. And it's not because we don't actually love each other. It's because no one's actually asked us, what would it look like if you use your creative genius to transform an institution that impacts our city? No one's ever unleashed our creativity beyond make this thing beautiful, get some people to show up. But no one, even in creative processes, and I've been a part of several, creatives are never involved in the conversation, rarely involved in the conversations about transforming institutions. They're involved in conversations about how to market those institutions better, how to make them look different to different audiences, but not how you bring in the Hip Hop Theater Festival to transform the way Arena Stage operates. Bring in a new audience, cool. Change the way we work, it's a different kind of thing. I mean, I'm super excited about folks in large institutions who are not just interested in growing audience, but changing the way systems work. But I think part of the challenge that we have as a community is to think more broadly, to think about how it is that you can share the things that you have to transform the things that matter to you. When we think about systems, there are several. We could talk about economics, poverty, education, business, labor, religion, entertainment, politics, law, justice, war, health, wellness. Can I ask you a question? The conversations about the police are always so basic. What we ultimately want is police to stop killing unarmed black and brown men and women and unarmed everybody else. But why don't we ask a different question? Why when you call 911 is the only people you can actually have sent to deal with a situation the police or the fire department? Why can't you actually call and have a social worker dispatched? Why is it that the systems that are set up are designed for a one-size-fits-all model? Who are the people that are thinking about the way the systems that currently govern the way that we live actually impact our lives? And where are we in those conversations? Have we even tried to be at the table? I have not. I don't know about you all, but I know that it's necessary at this point, that I have to be. Because ultimately, the institutions I don't engage will engage my community in a way that I don't want them to. And so if I'm not actively advocating for a different strategy, a different approach, I don't think I wouldn't say that I'm to blame for that, but I'm accountable. I'm accountable for the idea that when police come into a neighborhood, how about this? Why don't police officers have information about all the jobs that are available in Chinatown if they work in Chinatown? To talk to and engage young people as opposed to policing their behavior. And I know the answer is because that's not what police were created for, but so what? Why can't we reimagine something new? When police go in and patrol a neighborhood, I'm sticking with the police just because it's an easy example. When police go into a neighborhood, have they ever actually taken a banker to go and talk about micro-lending in a community, to invest in it, to actually go directly at poverty by investing in entrepreneurs? Earlier this year in the city of Baltimore, the mayor approved a $50 million budget to build a new youth prison. Can you imagine if you had taken that same $50 million and decided to invest in 300 young entrepreneurs in Baltimore? How that city would be changed? How it is that investing actual money in things that produce more jobs and more opportunities would actually change a community? But instead, most of us, when we saw that article, we just said, oh, it's terrible, he's building a youth prison, but never advocated for a different strategy. Never actually got into a conversation with these institutions about how it is that they serve or don't serve our interests. I've met lots of people who work in large institutions, and to be honest, they're a lot like the people in this room, confined and constrained by a set of rules and obligations that aren't rooted in love, that are often rooted in control. And I think that this is also the reason why I was so excited about this topic, because for 10 years of running this small nonprofit, I was interested in control. How it is that I could do the things that I wanted to do and hire the people I wanted to hire, but not how I could be just. How I could actually care as much about the artists that I employ as the young people that we inspire and empower. And that was on me. But I don't think I was alone in that. I don't think I'm alone in being someone that runs an organization that doesn't actually understand the power of love to transform your institution, to transform the way you work, to transform the lives of the people who've dedicated their lives to transforming this planet. And I think that part of our responsibility as a creative community is to think through how we unleash our imaginations, how it is that we put ourselves into conversations that usually we're excluded from or choose to not participate in. How do we advocate with the city council or our local ANC for folks that are in DC? How many people have ever been to an ANC meeting who live in DC? So like 20 of you out of 200. For the rest of you, how many of you actually know what an ANC is? Okay, like another 20. So I asked the question in part because that's hyper-local government that's involved in your community that has resources, but often doesn't have ideas. They don't have your creative brilliance. So what would it look like if you decided to pick an institution that you wanted to be a part of the transformation of, that you brought your amazing creativity, your brilliance, and your love to talk about policy, to talk about practice, to talk about initiatives, and how it is that we think about the role of institutions in our life and in the lives of people who we love, of our family and of our community. I think, to be honest, this is our true challenge. Beyond the form of art you practice, or the community you say you're a part of, how do you actually transform the institutions that impact all of us? It might sound like it's a really big, difficult thing, but you know the other thing I found out about most big institutions? It's really a small handful of people that are running those things. They've often got large amounts of money to make things look way bigger than they are. But if you can influence a small group of people to reimagine something that's possible through experience, through creativity, we could transform this whole city. So we're talking about a broken city, a broken society, broken institutions. I would actually argue something different. I would argue that we have and are affected by institutions that lack imagination, that lack the ability or the pressure to do something differently. In Washington, D.C., I don't know how many of you have actually paid attention to this, I often drive through my neighborhood and see when people get pulled over, there are 3 police cars that pull up. There's 3 police officers for 1 traffic stop. What if one of those literally was a social worker? What if one of those literally was a banker? So the idea that we don't stick to the idea that institutions are the way they would always be, that we can actually be a part of their transformation. If we bring ourselves, our full selves, our creativity, our imagination, our love, we can actually be the change, not just that we wish to see, but that we know is possible and necessary. Thank you so much.